Good evening, everyone. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's Charles Heimoff Lecture in German Studies. And let me just begin by saying anyone who comes out in the second week of December for a lecture on Job is my kind of person. Tonight's talk, Moral Interpretations of the Book of Job, will be delivered by Karen Feldman, professor of German at the University of California, Berkeley. And forgive me, but I feel like we have spoken about just about everything this semester in this room, from the most basic questions of war and peace, democracy and autocracy, the big issues of the past in the US and Germany, the fundamentals of creativity, and all those curious materials that get used in Candace Lynn's very cool artwork. Sorry, Candace, couldn't resist. Hope you're okay. So it seems wonderfully appropriate to end this semester's fellows' presentations with the Book of Job and the biggest question of them all. Why are these things happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? Or what did we do to deserve this? And it's particularly appropriate at the moment because there are a lot of awful things happening in the world, and it is unclear what we did to deserve them. I have to say I love the Book of Job. To me, it is the poison pill in the Old Testament, the book that undermines every other book in the canon. All this profound storytelling and law-giving to make us believe that if we do right and observe the law, we'll be rewarded. And then along comes Job, this non-Israelite, maybe he's an Edomite, maybe he's something else, and he comes along to say, forget about it. In the end, you will get dealt a terrible fate even if you are blameless. Theodicy, the notion that there is a direction in history that will show the Almighty's goodness and ultimate design, forget about it. And what's more, your good-for-nothing friends come and implore you to fess up. You're being punished, so you must be guilty. I'm sure our two resident Yiddishists, I think Saul is not here tonight, but Ross is, they can supply some ripe words to describe these three stooges or nudniks or schlemiels or whatever, whose obnoxious moralizing is going to be at the heart, I think, of tonight's lecture. Well, I'm only sorry we don't have a record of what the rabbis were thinking 2,000 years ago when they included the book in the Old Testament. That would be something to read. This is a true story. When my wife and I moved to Washington in the 90s, we joined a class at our synagogue on the Book of Job, and it had been going on for 4 or 5 years. And at the pace it was going, it should have ended right about now. And as the great American humorist Dave Barry would say, I am not making this up. And anyone who wants the rest of the story, which is not fit for this podium, I will tell afterwards. Philosophers and writers of all stripes have been gnashing their teeth and pulling out their hair about Job for centuries, and understandably so. And exactly at this moment, when there is a lot of reason to wonder, to put it in our secular frame, if the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, it is a privilege to have a terrific scholar plunging us into different interpretations of the text and giving us, if it isn't too much to hope for, a metaphysical reset. A quick word about the fellowship. The Charles Heimoff Fellowship in German Studies was inaugurated this fall and is funded by the Charles Heimoff Foundation based in Geneva. The fellowship honors the eponymous Mr. Heimoff, a man who had an extraordinary life in his own way. I think Job had nothing on him. And he started out as a Berliner who had to flee National Socialism, but kind of like Job at the very end of the book, he was enormously successful as an entrepreneur, an international businessman, and a supporter of cultural endeavors. And the goal of this fellowship is to promote German culture and German studies, and thanks to the Foundation's great generosity, we have been able to host 3 outstanding individuals this fall, Nora Krug, Saul Zaret, and tonight's lecturer, Karen Feldman. About our speaker. As I noted, Karen is professor of German at the University of California, Berkeley, and her work sits precisely at the intersection of philosophy, rhetoric, and literary interpretation. She holds a BA from the University of Chicago and an MA and a PhD in philosophy from DePaul University. In 2000, she came to Berkeley's Department of Rhetoric as a visiting assistant professor, and she joined the Department of German in 2007. Her work reflects a philosophical and literary critical approach to classic texts of the German literary and philosophical canon, with a strong emphasis on critical theory. She is also a woman of great character. She sat through a presentation in San Francisco last April, where a very famous national security figure made terrible slurs about French critical theory, and she just smiled and let it pass. It was like a drive-by killing, and she just wasn't bothered. Anyway, she's produced publications on a wide range of topics across 3 centuries, from Kant to Nietzsche to Walter Benjamin, Adorno, Heidegger, and Hannah Arendt. She is the author of Arts of Connection, Poetry, History, Epochality, published in 2019 in the prestigious Paradigm series, edited by Rudiger Kampe and Paul Fleming. She's also the editor of Binding Words, Conscience, and Rhetoric in Hobbes, Hegel, and Heidegger. I used to work at Time magazine, and that is alliteration worthy of anything we ever wrote. She is also the editor of Freud and Monotheism, Moses and the Violent Origins of Religion, and Continental Philosophy in Anthology. She has held fellowships from the Fulbright program, and way back in 2010, she was a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and was working with Professor Sibylle Kramer, who I had the pleasure of sitting next to tonight and who we're honored to welcome in the audience. So it's not surprising that Karen knows a million people who in Berlin, who we call professional contacts, but who are in fact people and have really interesting things to say. And we are pleased to have many of them here tonight, so welcome. She has also done research for the Cultural Foundations of Europe Research Cluster at the University of Konstanz and the Enlightenment Religion Knowledge Cluster at the University of Halle. I don't detect any Southern European warm places here, Karen. What? No? Okay. In 2023, she was a fellow of the Cluster of Excellence Temporal Communities at the Freie Universität Berlin, where she was working on a project on Erich Auerbach's mimesis, uncovering the Jewish intellectuals that informed that great man's thinking. She has also been generous in sharing her insights in 2 external public lectures, both of which drew strong crowds and lively discussion. And at the Academy, she has been working on a book project entitled The Rhetoric of Moralizing on Affect, Epistemology, and Knowing Better. So philosophy is traditionally interested in moral principles. Karen approaches the topic from a genuinely rhetorical perspective, and the project considers rhetorical, epistemic, and effective dimensions of moralizing. And we very much look forward to diving into the topic of moralizing tonight. Just a little housekeeping. Karen will talk for about 30 minutes. That's what they always say. And once we open for questions, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, make sure that your question indeed ends with a question mark. No lamentations will be tolerated tonight. I also want to remind everyone that the Academy's mission is to promote open and thoughtful exchange and to, and like Job, we will not curse our creator, and to be the place of serious dialogue. So we ask that all conversation tonight, as at all of our events, reflects respect for differing perspectives. Thank you. Karen, I'm delighted to yield the podium.
I want to thank Dan for that very generous and witty introduction. And also want to thank him for inviting me to be here for these wonderful few months. Thanks to the Charles Heimoff Foundation, and thanks beyond measure to the staff of the Academy, the program team, the kitchen staff, hospitality, reception, infrastructure, librarians, executive team, development, communications, finance, personnel. And there are others, and they do amazing work to make this all come together. To my fellows, thank you for this fabulous company and illuminating exchanges. I don't want to be last. I don't want to be the last one, and I don't know what we're all going to do next week without each other. So it's been a wonderful time. So as Dan mentioned in his introduction, my larger project has to do with moralizing, with what makes people so sure they know what is right, and especially what makes them so interested in telling other people what they are doing wrong. That kind of moral certainty, like all kinds of certainty, combines affective elements, feeling certain for one, with epistemological elements, feeling that we know, and it also includes rhetorical elements. What kinds of language and persuasive devices do we use to convey that certainty to others? What does this have to do with the book of Job? Well, a large part of the text consists in speeches that Dan referred to by Job's interlocutors, his friends, in which they insist to Job, those are rhetorical elements, on their certainty, combining affective and epistemological elements, their certainty of God's justice, and their certainty that Job's suffering must make sense in some larger picture. But the term moralizing also means discovering a moral or drawing a moral from a story. There are, of course, over 2 millennia of Jewish and Christian theological tradition alone, many different morals that have been drawn from the book of Job. So, for instance, the moral of the book of Job has been taken to be, among the following: we should be patient and faithful to God. We should stand firm in our protests and our questioning of God. God cares deeply for human beings. God does not care about human beings. God is unfathomable. God is a just judge. God is a merciless despot. We should cleave to him. We should abandon him in all religion. We are like Job. We are like the friends. We are like Job's wife. We are like Satan. You can just imagine the clergy person racking their brains for the theme of their next sermon. But then how is it possible that different interpretations draw wildly different morals or lessons, or even simply interpretations, from one and the same story? And in particular, where the story is a staging of a contestation around the question, what is the moral here? This makes for a kind of layer cake of moralizing in talking about the book of Job. So in the text, Job's friends perform that first kind of moralizing with their self-certain speechifying, and the story of Job has been understood by interpreters over millennia as having a moral lesson. But in fact, there are even more layers here, because it's not just about the morals that the friends impose on Job. Thank you to some Academy children for these diagrams. We can also ask, what is the moral that Job is seen to draw from his suffering? What does he draw from it? What lesson is God imparting in his speech? And from those, we can also draw further lessons and morals and interpretations. Many moral interpretations have emphasized Job's patience, faith, and virtue, relying on James 5:11's reference to the patience of Job. I'm losing it here. In the New Testament. Job is also a key book in the tradition of theodicy, that is, in debates about whether God allows evil or chooses evil, or whether evil exists somehow in spite of God. But for my talk today, I have cherry-picked some unorthodox, relatively recent interpretations of Job that illuminate several different literary, rhetorical, and philosophical techniques of interpretation. For instance, some readers tease a surprising lesson from Job by pulling on a small story thread, and others take the story as a whole as a larger moral allegory. There are interpretations that use Job to talk about the Holocaust, and then there are other approaches that subsume the book of Job's moral yield to its soaring poetic achievement. So that is an outline of the kinds of interpretations I offer. And at the end, I will also talk about Job's friends in more detail to provide some analytical lenses for understanding contemporary self-certain moralizing. So let me give you the summary in case anyone forgot. Pious Job is careful to honor God in all that he does after he gets a tip from Satan that Job's piety might not be genuine, and Job loses his health, wealth, status, and children. Job complains with some friends about his suffering, and he demands that God appear, and the friends argue with him. They essentially insist that God must have his good reasons, and then God shows up near the end, does not directly answer any of Job's complaints, but he orders Job to gird his loins like a man, and then God thunders at him about all creation, magnificence of nature, and scary beasts. And then in the closing moments, God praises Job, criticizes the friends, and here he gives them even more than he had to start with, including all new children. So a focus on that last bit has been key to many moral interpretations, including the interpretation that faith and patience are virtuous and will be rewarded. But deciding what the moral of any story is depends on what you take to be the ending. Okay, this one was not from the children. I take ownership of this diagram. This makes for some interesting possibilities for interpreting Job, because some scholars suggest that the prose frame story here in yellow was all a later addition. So that would mean all the setup with Satan's appearance and all the bad things that befall Job, and then at the end where Job gets everything back. Now, if a reader focused instead only on the big gray middle, which is written in poetry, and if they took that alone as the book of Job, then the ending of the book would be just after God gives his thunderous speech, when Job, and I have it in the blue stripe there, resigns in dust and ashes. If those lines of Job are taken to be the ending, that suggests very different morals, very different lessons and interpretations, and I'll come back to that. So here's just to keep track of where we are. We're on thread-pulling interpretations. The story of Job's suffering is set off, as we all know, by the figure of Satan, or the Satan, which Robert Alter translates with an epithet, the adversary. Satan, the adversary, shows up in the opening frame story. He instigates God's doubts, and he reduces Job to his miserable state. And then this adversary never appears again. Carl Jung's small book, Answer to Job, pulls at this little thread, this small observation, and from that yields a surprising interpretation of the events of the story that in turn suggest a humanist moral. So where did the Satan go? Why doesn't he come back at the end? Jung argues that the Satan is not really a distinct character, but is actually part of God's own consciousness. The Satan is God's own jealous thoughts, God's own doubts about how much people genuinely worship him. And Jung claims that he doesn't fully disappear from the story. Instead, those doubting and jealous thoughts are repressed, but imperfectly. And that explains why when God does come to Job out of the whirlwind, his speeches are so aggressive, so blustering, why he rants on and on about how powerful he is and how frightening his monsters are. Gird your loins like a man is God's macho phallic compensation for his own doubts and his own jealousy. God's ranting at Job is not about convincing Job, but about convincing himself of his own power, the power that was put into question by God's own nagging inner voice in the character of the Satan. And in these closing lines of that long poetic section, Job demonstrates, Jung argues, a greater power of reflection than God himself. That is with these lines, I repent in dust and ashes. Job is backing off because he has gained insight into God's self-obsession, an insight that God doesn't have about himself. So with this interpretation of the story, Jung draws from the book of Job a humanist moral that we human beings have a unique capacity of reflection on ourselves, superior even to that of any God we might invent. It's a surprising reading and definitely goes against the grain of the patience of Job or theodicy. Let me give you another surprising reading of the book of Job that proceeds by pulling at a seemingly even smaller thread, namely the role of women in the book of Job. In the prose frame story, Job's wife appears, unnamed, only to advise her suffering husband to curse God and die. Most interpretations that refer to Job's wife at all portray her as urging on a wicked rebellion by Job against God. St. Augustine even describes Job's wife as the helpmeet of the devil. Ilana Pardes, however, argues that Job's wife's scolding demonstrates a wisdom that prefigures and maybe even evokes Job's own impatience that occupies most of the book. Because despite our trope of the patience of Job, Job is not patient. He curses his own birth and he protests for many pages. So Job's wife is more important than people take her to be in understanding Job's lengthy laments and arguments. But Pardes pulls some more on this tiny thread of the place of women. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He called the name of the first one Dove, the name of the second Cinnamon, the name of the third Horn of Eyeshade, and there were no women in the land so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an estate among their brothers. This may look like a throwaway happy ending, but note all the attention to Job's daughters. Pardes informs us that this is the only place in the entire Hebrew Bible where a father names his daughters, and the text specifies that he gives his daughters part of his estate. She argues that the frame story ending, of which this is part, in its laconic way, suggests that Job is transformed by his encounter with God, and in particular, that he is more engaged with human relations and especially with women afterwards. Through his rebellious encounter inspired by his wife's brief line, Job has become a family man, overall less obsessed with God in a way we might today consider healthier. So, for instance, I won't read these, but you can look at it. The opening frame story that I have on top shows Job at the beginning of the book of Job off busying himself with sacrifices while the rest of the family is feasting together. The end, shown at the bottom, has Job breaking bread with his family and letting them comfort him instead of worrying about appeasing God. So, Pardes has Job taking a lesson from his wife and learning a lesson about being a family man. And for Pardes, it's part of a further lesson or moral in her book, namely that throughout the Hebrew Bible, there is a counter-tradition of women's voices that speaks against canonical moralizations of the Hebrew Bible. So René Girard was originally a scholar of French literature who developed social theories about human rivalry and violence. Girard pulls on a thread of the story in which Job describes his suffering at the hands of other people in order for Girard to draw out a social anthropological moral. You can read this for yourselves. Girard argues that Job's speeches actually show that his rejection by other people produces more suffering than the afflictions wrought by the adversary, because Job can at least accept those latter afflictions as being God's will. And Job, I've highlighted here, is especially troubled by his loss of status, noting how all kinds of lowlifes and social outcasts now delight in despising Job as being even lower than they are, spitting in his face and mocking him. That's not what I meant to do yet. Girard interprets the book of Job as demonstrating that human victimization is the deepest cause of Job's misery. This is the moral for Girard, not just of Job, but Girard's entire career. He analyzes victimization and scapegoating as a mechanism that developed in human history to channel rivalries that would produce all against all violence. Girard argues that the Hebrew Bible, and even more, he believes, the New Testament, enacts in its narrative a sympathy for victims, and that the Bible in its very existence opens up a new historical era in which violence and victimage are surpassed as mechanisms for overcoming aggression and rivalry. So I've given you some examples of perhaps surprising moral interpretations that emerge by pulling at seemingly small threads. Let me give you an example of a large-scale interpretation. Antonio Negri recasts the entire book of Job as a communist existentialist moral allegory. Specifically, it's an allegory of unjust compensation and the fallacy of reciprocal justice. Job's friends try to convince him that he must have sinned, that there is a logic of exchange or compensation, but we know from the book that Job was pious, that according to Negri, he had been loyal to all the measures that regulated the world supported by God. And Negri concludes, we're like Job. The questions and answers that we pose are the same as his. We express ourselves with desperation. We utter the same blasphemous phrases. We've known riches, hope. We've tempted God with reason, and we're left with dust and inanity. So the moral of the Job allegory is that our deeply held beliefs that we inhabit a world of just rewards, those beliefs are mistaken with regard to God and capitalism. Job's pious labors are not properly rewarded, which reveals the entire cosmic logic to be a sham. The moral is there is no transcendent value beyond the world and no existing proper measure in the world. And therefore, Negri concludes with a moral demand. We need to perform a reconstruction of the world and its value. In case you were here for Alex Kleeman's presentation a few weeks ago, I think it connects here in how she imagines forms of exchange and relation that stretch beyond the bounds of capitalism. Just to keep on time here, I'll just be very brief in mentioning another example of an allegorical interpretation by Susan Neiman, our neighbor over in Potsdam at the Einstein Forum. Neiman argues that Job's outrage is not actually about his own suffering, but expresses a demand for reason to exist in the world. The friends, in her reading, insist there's reason in the world, there's good reason here. And then God's voice out of the whirlwind, in some interpretations, including Hobbes, has been interpreted as a sheer assertion of power, the despot model. But Neiman argues no, God's voice just describes what is, all of nature, all of being. God's speeches are the sheer assertion of reality, while the friends represent the claims of reason, and Job stands for the demand that the two ought to be brought together. In other words, that reality should become reasonable. Neiman thus takes Job as a large-scale philosophical allegory. We're, of course, here in Germany, and it seems especially important to note that the book of Job has been one touch point for responses to the Holocaust. Margaret Sussman, you can say here, is not as famous as her contemporaries, who included Martin Buber, Georg Simmel, and Ernst Bloch, but her book, Das Buch Job und das Schicksal des jüdischen Volks, the book of Job and the destiny of the Jewish people, not yet translated, if anyone wants to take it up there. It's said to be the first Jewish theological attempt to understand the Holocaust in 1946. For Sussman, Job is a universal exemplary moral figure, and like with Job's suffering, Jewish suffering she takes as a sign of connection to God, and she claims that suffering is even the mission of the Jewish people. Some scholars, for instance, Vivian Liska, have objected that Sussman's glorification of suffering evokes a Christian typological connection between Job and Christ and mutes the Holocaust in the glow of theodicy. Elie Wiesel is the best known of post-Holocaust writers, a Romanian-American Jewish Holocaust survivor who won the Nobel Prize. Over his career, he writes about Job in connection with the Holocaust, and his essay, Job, Our Contemporary, first registers a moral objection to Job's repentance in Dust and Ashes and the book's ending. I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time. I have some of it highlighted. So, Wiesel quotes this whole thing. I'm just choosing parts. He should not have given in so easily. He should have continued to protest, to refuse the handouts. Job should have said to God, do I have the moral, the human right to accept an ending, a solution to this story in which my children have played roles that you have imposed on them? I demand that justice be done to them, if not to me, and that the trial continue. Yes, that is what Job should have said. This is Wiesel writing. Only he did not. He agreed to go back to living as before. Therein lay God's true victory. He forced Job to welcome happiness. After the catastrophe, Job lived happily, in spite of himself. So here Wiesel makes a moral condemnation of Job in the story, imagines what Job should have done instead. He imagines a different Job who would not acquiesce, who would continue putting God on trial and refuse the happy ending that Wiesel touchingly portrays as the ultimate violence that God visits upon Job. I imagine this as Wiesel's response to Holocaust theodicies that take Job as a whole as an allegory for the Jewish people and interpret the creation of the state of Israel as analogous to giving Job more than he had before, including all new children, which is a real sticking point because how could new Jewish children in Israel ever replace the 1.5 million murdered Jewish children of Europe? But then Wiesel tries out a different interpretation of the ending in a way that, by the way, revisits the question of what is the real ending. And I'll read the highlighted parts. Job discovered a novel method to persevere in his resistance. He pretended to abdicate before he even engaged his battle. By repenting sins he didn't commit, by justifying a sorrow he didn't deserve, he communicates to us that he didn't believe in his own confessions. They were nothing but decoys. Job personified man's eternal quest for justice and truth. He did not choose resignation. Here, Wiesel does not imagine an alternative Job who did not acquiesce, but like Jung, he interprets Job as not truly acquiescing, as only pretending. Wiesel depicts the ironic situation. We know that he didn't believe in his repentance, that it was an act of resistance, but for God it was an effective decoy. Now I am turning to some post-theodicy readings of Job, but actually by rewinding a few centuries, as I'll explain. Historian Jonathan Sheehan describes how in the German Enlightenment, there was a craze for Job and Job translations, but this was not driven by concern for any moral or any theodicy. Rather, after the decline in the dominance of typological and prophetic readings of Job, 18th century German translators of the Hebrew Bible shared the project of recuperating the Old Testament with respect to the poetic experience it evokes. Thus, for Prussian philosopher and theologian Johann Gottfried Herder, the book of Job did not teach any moral, but produced an experience of terror and domination. God's speech has us experience our subjection to God's inscrutable plan. Robert Alter's work on Job also presents this aesthetic tradition of the sublime. Alter argues that the magnificent language of God's poetry defeats the moralizing of the friends. So the moral of the reading of Alter, if we can call it that, is the sublime poetic experience that actually exceeds moralizing. So far, I've presented some broad moral lessons that have been drawn from the book of Job. But if you remember the layer cake, moralizing, as I've also just talked about, is what goes on in a large portion of the texts with his friends. So with the friends, we can get closer to some contemporary complaints that people have about moralizing. Immanuel Kant, an 18th century philosopher considered a progenitor of the European Enlightenment, emphasizes the dishonesty of Job's friends. The friends even flatter God as if God were listening in. I'll summarize the text here. The friends suck up to God. They simulate a certainty of the justice of Job's suffering that Kant thinks they do not have. In contrast to Job's laments and protests, in contrast to when he laments and protests, Job also expresses what Kant calls a sincerity of heart or honesty, because Kant explains he possesses rational faith. That's a whole other Kant topic I'm happy to go into in discussion. Kant evokes a key aspect of moralizing that applies to our contemporary complaints, namely that there's something dishonest about it, something dissimulated or exaggerated or even projected. Someone who is moralizing might say or even believe that they are simply helping understand or giving a different perspective. But part of what rankles with moralizing is the sense that there is something ingenuine in it, particularly in disingenuous contemporary politics that hitches itself to moralizing. Karl Jaspers adds some illumination here. In an echo of Kant's reading, Jaspers writes, Job's theological friends advance pious theses and arguments. Job perceives their falsehood, and the seeming weight of the friends' arguments adds to his indignation. The friends, whom Jaspers calls the theologians, want to force Job to acknowledge their doctrine, but he doesn't want doctrine. The friends demonstrate the contemptuous indignation of fanaticism clinging to dogma. That sounds familiar. For Jaspers, the dialogue between friends and Job embodies the conflict between self-certainty and an honest search for the truth. So with this brief focus on the friends in Kant and Jaspers, I now want to attempt to connect my talk to contemporary moralizing. Dan has teased all semester that I'm going to provide the zinger answers for your holiday table. But I have to apologize. I'm not going to do that. My interest is not prescriptive for anyone. It's analytical, using tools of literary theory, rhetorical theory, and philosophy. And so it's a stretch here, perhaps, but I ask for your latitude and grace to ask the question, what are the epistemological, affective, and rhetorical conditions and devices of moralizing? First, the epistemological parts, which have to do with knowledge, certainty, and the difference between them. At the risk of scaring some people off, I want to introduce some Hegel to illuminate this further. Because in his phenomenology of spirit, Hegel plays out scenes in which a moral consciousness, in self-righteously asserting its own morality and condemning others, exhibits what I think we're talking about with regard to why moralizing today is so annoying. So, for instance, Hegel depicts how, when this admittedly abstract moral consciousness judges another abstract consciousness and asserts its own morality, that moral consciousness is actually failing to be moral. What it's moralizing with its declarations and its judging, what all that moralizing conveys is not any morality of what is being talked about. Instead, what is being conveyed is the moral consciousness's own certainty. This is maybe why God says the friends do not speak the truth about him and that Job does, because what the friends are asserting is their own certainty rather than anything about the morality of what is going on with Job. Hegel shows that what moralizing ends up stating is its certainty of itself and of its own truth, which entails a sort of bait and switch about whatever the ostensible moral issue is. And perhaps this is why God seems pretty annoyed at the friends and why moralizing is for all of us annoying, because it involves a moral grandstanding that is more a statement about the one moralizing than about the actual situation. Because we know or feel that whatever morality is supposedly at stake is a dishonest cover for a certainty that is not necessarily knowledge. Here's another thing Hegel lays out. Moral declarations also fail to enact the morality of which the moral consciousness is so certain. He writes, and I'll hold your hand through it, it is the hypocrisy which wants to know, the moral consciousness, which wants to know that its judging is to be taken as the actual deed, and which, instead of proving its uprightness in action, proves it by means of speaking about its own splendid dispositions. So judgy moral consciousness makes a show or a performance of virtue and duty, but that is dishonest and annoying because that judgy moralizing is the whole show of duty and not any doing of any actual duty. This is, I believe, one of the things that rankles us about moralizing. It's a show of duty or morality. It takes its own judgments as a moral deed, as if, as Hegel has here, offering its splendid dispositions or more uttering fine sentiments, as if that were the same as a real moral action. So that's the explanation, with the help of Hegel, of the epistemological elements of contemporary moralizing and how they, in some part, explain why moralizing is so annoying. So a larger project goal is to examine the rhetorical elements of moralizing. And to keep this simple, I'll focus on one rhetorical device that is called paradiastole. Paradiastole, or perhaps more easily said, rhetorical redescription. This refers to when one and the same phenomenon is described in different ways in order to give it a particular cast, and particularly a moral cast. So Quintilian gives these examples of calling yourself bold instead of reckless, calling yourself wise or knowledgeable instead of cunning or crafty. So the catalog of Job interpretations could be revisited in light of this rhetorical device. Is Job pridefully rebelling against God, as the Friends say, or is he being honest, as Kant says? The descriptions convey different moral casts regarding what is depicted. You might remember my suggestion earlier that perhaps the Friends don't see themselves as moralizing at all. For the contemporary context, rhetorical redescription is the figural way that moralizing can disavow itself. I'm not moralizing. I am merely providing another perspective. I'm helping you to understand. I'm pointing out some implications you may not have perceived. I'm just helping. So how we describe something is decisive, and it smuggles in a moral valence. For this reason, paradiastole is the key rhetorical device, I would argue, when it comes to moralizing. I want to note for those of us who have been around at the American Academy these last few months, it's also, I think, been a key aspect of our discussion about whether we should be using the word fascism to talk about what's going on in the USA. And the answer is yes. We should use the word fascism. Will's famous slide, if you missed it, you can ask him for it. His famous slide says it all. So before ending, I'm going to quickly talk about the affective component of moralizing. Political theorist Wendy Brown makes use of Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality to develop an argument that political moralizing happens when a genuine affect, a moral impulse, sours in the context of impotence. In that instance, what she calls a galvanizing social vision is replaced by a reproachful sensibility, a reproachful moral sensibility. Thus, she writes, moralizing is when the telos, or the goal of the good, vanishes, but the yearning for it remains. It's when that happens that morality appears to devolve into moralism in politics. And life-affirming moral passion thereby converts to life-negating moralizing rancor. The genuine moral disposition and propensity out of disappointment, soured into moralizing, criticizes anything tainted with power, as she explains. But then what in life is not tainted with power? This conundrum makes for a certain streak of nihilism in moralizing. It might explain also why moralizing is exhausting, why it puts us off our otherwise constructive predilections, because moralizing infects us with a morality that has been distorted by nihilism. So I'm coming to my conclusion now. The book of Job is on multiple levels tied to the question of what the moral of a story is and how it is to be discerned. First of all, because that is precisely what the story is about. The story portrays Job asking to understand what's happened to him, what is the moral of his own story. The Friends tell him what the moral is, theodicially defending God's justice. And then different interpretations yield different morals. The story or parts of the story are taken to implicitly answer Job in different ways. So I've talked about the book of Job and several approaches that yield these heterogeneous interpretations. Some of them pull on small threads. Some make arguments that the book is a large-scale allegory. Some use Job to talk about the Holocaust. Some suggest a theodicy. Some yield humanistic morals. Some emphasize the poetic achievement of the work as in effect beyond morality. And at the end, I tried to offer some hooks or ways into larger questions about contemporary moralizing that I hope the various Job interpretations help to illustrate. what are moralizing's rhetorical elements, epistemological elements, and affective elements. But with Job, it's all still unfinished. There is no final word. There is rather an underdetermined logic to this story, a lacuna where we might seek reasons and morals. And this is my ending. Erich Auerbach describes this in his monumental book, Mimesis, as how the Hebrew Bible is fraught with background. And his lesson is directly relevant here. The laconic and multivalent text leaves open precisely the possibility of such wildly divergent interpretations and such utterly different morals and lessons. Thank you.
I loved that. I loved when you were talking about reality failing to align with reason and reason failing to align with reality, and you seeded a little question there about Kant and the rationalization. And so I want to hear you talk more about that.
Sure, thank you. So I talked on the one hand about Susan Neiman's interpretation of the book of Job as an allegory. That went a little fast, I realize, where the friends are asserting there's supposed to be reason. Like, hey, we can explain it. It's all rational here. God shows up and just says reality. People struggle with God's speeches. He's just saying, I invented this, I did that, the beast, the nature, the mountain, and he just says it all. He says reality. The friends claim reason, and she takes that Job is demanding their integration. It's a little quasi psychoanalytic or something. She's like the ego function that would Job is the ego function to bring. She doesn't say that, to bring reality and reason together. Reality is the chaos that God creates. Reason is what the friends say is out there, and Job is demanding that they somehow come together and make sense. A great reading, an allegorical reading. No accident that Neiman is a philosopher. So Kant, you want to ask about rational faith? Okay, that's a little bit longer of a story here. I got my notes, but okay, I'll do without my notes. So Kant argues. Actually, I do want, because I have a good anecdote for that. Kant argues that true faith is rational. That you have to believe in God in a rational way, not in a passionate way, not in a feeling way, and it can't be doctrinal. You don't just believe it because it's doctrine. You have to deduce it, that God is rational and therefore God is true. I want to just tell you, because it's such an anecdote that I wanted to work into the paper and I couldn't do it. In his 1798 book, The Conflict of the Faculties, he illustrates the point that the existence of God has nothing to do with what happens on the earth. So it's sort of against Neiman. There's nothing connecting them. His illustration of that is the scene of Abraham nearly sacrificing Isaac in response to the command of God. Of course, you all know the story. Kant's approach is pretty startling because that scene is so often moralized, I would say perhaps in a more Protestant vein, as a test of Abraham's faith. But Kant says, good Kant that he is, asserts that Abraham should have been skeptical of an empirical experience of the voice of God. I'll read the Kant. I have it here. Abraham should have replied to this supposedly divine voice, that I ought not to kill my good son is quite certain, but that you, this apparition, are God, of that I am not certain and can never be, even if this voice rings down to me from heaven. So even God's thundering voice for Kant would be an empirical and therefore sketchy connection between God and the world. God's voice doesn't show up in the world. God is rational. That's the Kantian model. And so anything that shows up in the world is a sham. Be suspicious. He says, be suspicious of anybody that tells you that they've seen God or, had any empirical relationship to God. There is an epistemic gap between the world and God's rationality, and Abraham needed to so-called mind the gap. So, and Job's friends should also not presume, therefore, to connect worldly events to God's moral will. That's getting into the abstraction there.
Thank you for excuse me, that exposition of these interpretations, all within the Jerusalem side of our tradition. I wonder if you could say a few words about the other side, the Athens side of our tradition, and what that has to say about moralizing.
So I'm not a Bible expert, and I'm not not in classical philosophy either, but certainly there are traditions here that have had contact with each other, of course, of the notion of logos and reason, and then, by way of Neoplatonism and other strands of philosophical thought that over time have gotten intertwined with the theology. And that's a big topic that goes into the interpretations of Job that we see in, the philosophical vein. There's a long, I didn't even touch a midrash tradition of Job, and there's all kind, as I said, I cherry picked my interpretations for this audience and for my own competence in order to, make the points about the literary techniques and rhetorical devices and philosophical arguments. There would certainly be, a whole supermarket of other interpretations that would provide these and other examples of those kinds of tools.
Thank you for that lively and enlivening talk. I was wondering, as I'm a poet and not a philosopher, if you're familiar with the W.H. Auden poem, Law Like Love. Or probably some people here are, but somehow I felt in his thesis maybe that there's something about your thesis that's resonating with me with that poem, which I don't remember because my mind is a sieve, but I think it starts like law, says the philosophers, is the sun, and then like love, we seldom keep. And it's sort of about this question between the moralizing and the affective nature of being in the world and how to reconcile those two. So anyway, it's short, it's a fun read. And
excellent. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Auden. Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much, Karen, for that wonderful presentation. It was so interesting, engrossing, unexpected, and then fun. You prepared a wonderful buffet of interpretations of Job for us. I'm wondering if in your research you have a sense of what the contemporary interpretations are and what they say about how we are muscling the story of Job to fit our own purposes and our own need for moralizing.
Muscling
the story of Job to fit our own intentions and needs, or maybe desires for moral certitude.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, my table partner was posing the similar question about, how people, in a contemporary way might use Job to fit our own, whatever our own agendas are, you might mean, or and certainly, I haven't gotten into this, but that the victim narratives and an occasional sort of elevation of victimhood and kind of finding an identity within victimhood, which Wendy Brown writes a lot about, actually, that I didn't include here, would certainly have a lot to draw from Job in order to make some of those moves. That Job obviously could be deployed as an exemplum, for someone who wants to portray themselves as a victim of injustice, whether or not in fact, what they are suffering is unjust. Maybe it's just. So I think, contemporary interpretations of Job, super contemporary, I don't know, like of the moment, what was today, I don't know. Job is obviously a ripe source for sermons and talks and speeches. I was just so struck by how many people came up to me before this and said, I've always liked the book of Job. I always think about the book of Job. I've always read the book of Job. That was so surprising to me in a way that there were different kinds of passions showing up here, just around dinner and beforehand. So I think what I referred to at the end by way of Auerbach is the laconic nature of the narrative. The fact that it doesn't say that much. I mean, there's a lot of words and there's a lot of inference that goes on. It is what lends the highly it is what makes, which is Auerbach's point, it makes the Hebrew Bible so highly interpretable. It leaves so much in the background and the foreground, he says, is sort of blank and you don't really know what's going on. And, so I think I think the different agendas could make different excellent or nefarious uses of the book of Job. And that's probably true for any text or any story. The moral of the story isn't in the story. It depends on, of course, an interpretive process, which is some of the examples I gave.
Yes. I would like to say something. Wonderful talk, as always, Karen. Meeting you in the hallway or on the stairs is always, you say something and I have to go to bed to think about it for hours before I can respond. And I probably should go to bed for another 3 days after hearing you tonight, but I've not spent such an extended time in Europe. Usually, actually, I go to European countries on the Atlantic coast, so I've never been in a place like this where there isn't a big sea somewhere, and I'm struck by the Eurocentricness of so many of the talks here, or so many, and how could it not be Eurocentric if we are in Europe? But the suffering of Job, the Job story is known to many people, and who don't look like most people in this room, and have thoughts about it, and in fact might sometimes interpret their own experiences to be the sufferings, the actual the sufferings as nouns. And I wonder if in all of the situation, as we talk about these philosophers of the Enlightenment, and I hope I've said somewhere in this room before that most Enlightenment philosophy is a justification for what Europeans were doing in the rest of the world, geographies, history, and so on, and so forth. But I hope that. So is this a question? This is I have a question, but I never phrase it as a question because a question will require you to answer something that you probably haven't thought, not because you're not capable of thinking of it, it doesn't cross your mind. But this question of interpretations of Job, it's so fascinating to me that all these people have written about it, but have left out such central people in the world. And I wonder, is there people thinking about what would Job mean to Frederick Douglass, for instance? I
Thank
don't
you.
know if anybody in the room other than us know who Frederick Douglass was.
Thank you, Jamaica. Yeah, it's this is, the German-centric, Eurocentric angle, and I really would, I would like to read more and learn more. There is, of course, in Islam, renditions of a Job-like story, and there are other models that scholars who are not me have worked on. So I would love to, you gave me this wonderful book of terrible rhetoric and what was it called, The Ideology of Slavery, and I've been reading that, and we've talked about it now and then, and it's been very illuminating, the kinds of, especially Enlightenment style, it's Enlightenment thinkers expressing the ideology of slavery, and in starker terms than, Kant certainly said his things in the Anthropology, and there's all kinds of ugly, terrible stuff. But the book that we've been talking about that you gave me has been eye-opening to take seriously the actual Enlightenment style arguments for slavery. How the kind of philosophy that I read and work on turns into those kinds of treatises. It's been really shocking and valuable. Thank you.
Hi, Karen. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I have a feeling I wanted to have your thoughts on that. Could it be that the whole theodicy reading is sort of a taboo? From what you gave us, I had a feeling that no one is doing that. Everyone is doing something else. Everyone is trying to go allegoric, trying to read it into historical context, trying to do anything but doing a theodicy. Which is weird, because for the Enlightenment discourse, the theodicy is the discourse that starts something, right? I'm not super sure, but I think that Leibniz avoids the subject altogether. And I'd like to have your thoughts on this, because to me it seems like the Kantian differentiation between between the types of theodicy, like the theodicy of why does bad stuff happen and the theodicy of why does bad stuff happen to me after I was so good, seems to have destroyed the whole idea of reading the book of your in this direction. And after going through all these different approaches to the book that you just presented, I have the feeling, okay, this line of thought is done. We can't do it anymore. Is that true, or would you say I'm just misinterpreting your sources?
I cherry-picked. I warned you. They were cherry-picked. Sibylle Kramer was going to ask a question. So I was pretty taken with, I showed you Jonathan Sheehan's book, The Enlightenment Bible, which my fellow Ross and I saw it on his desk, and I was like, am I going to, because I had ordered it and it hadn't come yet, and I was going to, I didn't know, and I even I could open his door, it wasn't locked, but I didn't take it off his desk. He did give it to me when he was finished. The book is about translations of the Bible and a lot about translations of what would have been called the Old Testament in the 18th century, and specifically, this is maybe a little specialized, but for you, Simon, it'd be interesting to know how to look more into how Sheehan's claim is that that in roughly Enlightenment and beyond, as Romanticism developed also in the German tradition, that the theodicy did follow, that the doctrinal prophetic stuff became less powerful, less interesting, the figural not as important, and instead that is when, with of course the emergence of aesthetics, that the idea of the book of the Hebrew Bible, of Job in particular, as powerful, as evoking an experience as opposed to teaching you a doctrine. That's at least what Sheehan traces the melting away of the theodicial tradition and the emergence of the poetic aesthetic tradition in a way I found really convincing and useful. In terms of contemporary, it seems, the literature folks I read are probably not going to be working on theodicy, but that doesn't mean that people don't do it.
Thank you very much, Karen, for your interpretation. I've never reflected about the book of Job for the first time in my life. Yes, so sorry. And I have a very simple question. May I learn from what you have presented us that we have to make the difference between storytelling and reasoning, and that putting interpretation to storytelling is a kind of transferring reasoning to storytelling, and that this is a problem and not the highest level of what we have to do with stories or literature?
Thank you. I am in this matter very influenced by American Academy longtime alum from a long time ago, the late Hayden White, who writes about narrating and narrativizing and how it is that it's somehow a essential way of knowing. I would even, my own thoughts that I think White sets out are that, that when Kant talks about how we know, and Kant describes different faculties of knowing, and that's part of his major critical work, I think from Hayden White's corpus, I get the idea that storytelling is one of those faculties. It is a faculty of thought. Now, is it a faculty of reasoning? I think, the definition of reasoning starts to get tricky here, but insofar as storytelling requires that events be somehow connected, it's not just something. There has to be an event that leads to another event, or at least seems to, or there has to be some connecting principle. I think Hayden White, better than anybody, shows how the assumptions we make in storytelling and in reading stories about how those events are connected are moral assumptions. They're implicitly moral. They're sort of, in Kantian terms, like transcendentally moral. They're foundationally moral. Deciding what the end of something is, what the end of a story is, the ending tells you what kind of story it was all along. If they get married, it's a happy comedy. If everybody dies, it's a tragedy. The ending defines the whole story retroactively, which is why, what you take the ending of Job to be is going to make a big difference in your interpretation. And so with regard to storytelling, I think, again, Hayden White was writing about history, but he connected eventually to fiction and all narrating. That stories are part of the way we do what we now call reasoning. That might be a bit of a what do you call it, like a detour from what Kant may have meant by reasoning, but what people think of as reasoning now, for better or for worse, I think it does involve storytelling. I think that's, where we get these sometimes irritating, like, bureaucratic demands at the university to tell our story. I don't know if you guys have that too. Like, we gotta tell the story of the humanities. We gotta tell our story because that's how people will then, want to support us or whatever. You have to, so that it does replace, in some ways, making an argument. Stories are, for a lot of people, understandably more interesting than arguments. And maybe for that reason, storytelling is a form of persuasion. So it has a rhetorical element as well. So storytelling here, it precisely brings together affective, epistemological, and rhetorical elements in my reading. Sigrid Weigel, is it? Oh, you do, sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. That was beautiful and super interesting. I have a feeling that my question is in some way the last question, just in a different key, but I'll ask it anyway. And I wanted to use your metaphor, pull on the thread of the last slides you evoked with the quote from Wendy Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is Wendy Brown and not you necessarily, but when the telos of the good vanishes, but the yearning for it remains,
that morality appears, I can't read my handwriting, so you cite this as the way in which something turns into mere moralizing, and this is annoying. So I wanted to ask you to reflect on that in terms of your own analysis, or what is a form of telling the story of Job that doesn't devolve into moralizing, or that doesn't sour into some sort of programmatic truth-telling that actually undermines the very point of that truth-telling.
Well, it does. That's what Hayden White does talk about in this, as in some of his work, about how the moral part is there when you tell. It's hard to not tell it with sort of, even though you don't think of yourself as being moral, you're trying to give it a spin. Is it a funny story? Is it a sad story? Is it that somehow the events are supposed to mean something? Otherwise, it's not intelligible. And so the storytelling is a form of moral reasoning. Wendy Brown's argument is a little bit different in that she's drawing on Nietzsche's genealogy of morality when he writes about the invention of morality in some sort of semi-mythical context of what he calls slave morality, where the weak and poor kind of didn't have any chance to get power, and so they invented a whole new sphere that didn't require money or strength, the sphere of morality, and made the the powerful into the bad guys in the moral sphere only. Hence, in Christianity, the rich man passing through the eye of the needle, etc. Wendy Brown's borrowing of Nietzsche is really trying to, I think, explain how, and with a view toward, she was talking about left activism. People accuse the left of being moralizing and so forth. And she takes that seriously. She says, yeah, okay, maybe there is a moralizing tendency. Where does that come from? And the analysis is, it is that vision that gets so stunted. She describes it as impotent rage is the ingredient for moralizing. I think it's a really illuminating argument she makes. One thing that I do believe is missing, that I tried to capture more with the Kant and the whole sucking up element and the flattering, was does moralizing come about out of this impotent rage? I can imagine that's part of it. But what about the kinds of hypocrisy that Hegel refers to, sort of the self-aggrandizing, moral grandstanding, the, somehow inflating one's own moral position? She doesn't address that specifically. I mean, this is 20 years ago, this book, and so, there are other things people can say since then. But yeah, I think it's a useful analysis. She does write also in that book about sort of identitarian academic commitments and how they focus frustration about systemic problems onto individuals and blaming people for, whether they don't talk in the right way or whether they, perform individual actions that would not conform with the larger political vision that, the moralizer is holding fast to. Does that answer your question?
I mean, my question is is there a way out of that? I mean, that's a big question.
You haven't been here all semester, have you?
No.
That's what everybody, usually it's something, like how do we stop climate change or, okay, so how do we get out of moralizing? I don't know. Our dear colleague, Betsy Colbert, she's like, well, I know what's, some things are better than others for getting out of this. There's no one recipe. I do think that, the very powerful Jung interpretation, I do appreciate its humanism, the part about reflection, the part about, insight into oneself and one's own desire to be self-aggrandizing. So I guess that would be a recipe for, humility, or rhetorical care, or attending to the kinds of, language you use and the effects that it has. There's no magic on that. Tact, diplomacy, thoughtfulness, hard to inculcate any of those in another person, but
Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for the great talk. So what always struck me was how in the theological tradition, the way the book of Job was interpreted very much depended on what of the book of Job was even considered. So whether you're only reading the first 2 chapters or the first, 2/3 or so. And that also figured into how the book of Job was taken as a model of the epic, for example, or the heroic poem, and so on and so forth. And so from this, I was curious to hear you comment on what lends itself more to moralizing, prose or poetry. Having read Arts of Connection, I would have thought that probably you would be leaning on, towards the narrative and the hidden white that you just said. But then you commented on the rhetorical aspect, and that really kind of made me think that it was probably maybe poetry that was in fact the moralizing genre or form.
Thanks. Wow, somebody read the book. That's always really exciting. I think I got my one hand might have to get over. Anyway, so you can moralize in prose, you can moralize in poetry, you can tell stories in poetry, you can, associate more lyrically, to use the word broadly, in prose. So what lends itself? I think there are just different historical practices, right? There's the practice of composing the poem, and the practice of composing a play, for instance. Plays are obviously very useful for moralizing scenarios because you have different people talking, and you need some drama and there's conflict, and so moralizing in plays is useful. Job has a little stagey feel to it, as you said. Is it like some people talk about it as a tragedy? It doesn't really work that way. Epic, different genre debates about Job, trying to sort of squeeze it into some anachronistic genre that it doesn't really fit. So I would say that the interest in rhetorical devices, I don't make a distinction really between that and literary devices. Metaphor is a rhetorical device, it's a literary device. I read the Lausberg, and it's literary rhetoric. So the overlap in those devices and their uses are, utterly uncontrollable in my view. One more? Okay, one more question, please. Hi, Candace.
Hi, wonderful talk. I guess, okay, I'm going to try to form this into a question. As you were talking, especially towards the end, where you're kind of going through why moralizing is annoying, rhetorically, epistemologically, and effectively, I guess I found myself wondering, is it always annoying? Because I think there's a question I have around moralizing's relationship to power, because I feel like usually when moralizing is put down, there's often a generational thing, like especially in like contemporary things that come up recently. It's often like, oh, the young people are, cancel culture, or they're being polarizing, they're not listening, they're just judging. So there's this sense that moralizing is always divisive and does not serve an actual function. But there are other lessons, I think, in the Bible, although I don't know the Bible very well, that kind of like, I think there's one where Jesus is like a young boy and he like yells at the older men, the priests or something. I don't know. Anyway, but there must be other stories where the vulnerable or powerless is moralizing to like the one in power. But in this case, it feels like there's something, I don't know. Can you respond to that?
Sure. I hear what you're saying about, I'm thinking of, we're just talking in very vague contemporary tropes here. Like it's not, about young people these days, But the funny thing is, I think I'm getting old because I feel like young people might be thinking that I'm the one, as young people tend to do, say, oh, they're always telling me what to do. And they think, so I mean, I don't know about the generational, I don't know who's got the privilege on being labeled a moralizer. Because I could see, certainly many generations of young people have complained that their parents were always telling them, what was right and what was wrong. And so who has the power in that relationship? Actually, I really would say that the moralizing, even in that sort of familial generational relationship that you're referring to, or not in the family, would reflect a power dynamic, that moralizing is in some way a way to take power or assume power or create power, defined very broadly here, to, evoke a kind of a dominance. And insofar, I mean, Wendy Brown's point is that it happens more often on the side of those with less power. That's where moralizing becomes, in the tradition of Nietzsche's genealogy of morality, that the ones without power need some other tool, some more abstract, something that they can condemn other people with, even, inventing that morality in order to condemn people. Nietzsche writes like that morality was invented so that you could condemn people. That
They invented it's dismissed. And I just want to say one thing. Who the fuck is Heidegger to talk about morality?
Oh, we'll talk at breakfast. We got a lot to say. I see Dan is making his way up here. Can Siegfried Weigel ask a question first? Can we get one more? Johanna, is she still here? Johanna? Oh, I was thinking over here. Something. Oh, here it comes. Sorry, just one more. I'm sorry, Dan, I'm usurping your...
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, for your talk. It says a lot about our profession of interpretation. I have a suggestion, because I have the impression that there are different motivations to approach the book of Job. So and I would like to differentiate between a primal interest and, let's say, a secondary indirect interest. Because in the case of Kant, I think there was in the 18th century with the Enlightenment Bibles, in which the footnotes became longer and longer and longer because they had to struggle with so many narratives that are not plausible. So the fact that biblical narratives are not plausible is the basic challenge for what they called Vernunftsreligion. Therefore, the urgent need to harmonize reason and the narrative of the Bibles.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an explosion of commentaries and so on.
Yes.
And I see a different motivation in the examples of Alter, Neiman, Negris, and others, as an epoch in which the primal interest is to develop theory. But because this was in the academic culture of American universities, to develop an own theory is the gold standard of humanities. So, and you have to find a classical text to nobilitize your own theory. So the book of Job could be replaced by any other classical text that has a real tradition loaded with so many interpretations and commentaries. So therefore, I would say there are different levels of moralization. Mm-hmm. A primal, urgent need to do that. And I would say perhaps a secondary one.
Thanks. I would have a lot to say about the secondary one, because we can talk after. I have a whole materialist analysis of theory production at universities. In fact, just as you say, and more for junior people, you have to make your mark, you have to get a job, you have to have something that has your name on it. And so it's a professional deformation, in its own way, to have to assign. And I do think, it is also what I do, yes, developing the theory as opposed to what you're talking about, the 18th century, I don't know about primal, but at least text-oriented, obsessive explaining that at that point would require somehow making these stories palatable, understandable, relevant, and so forth. Clearly a completely different kind of commentary, which is maybe why my cherry-picked examples are all very modern. They're about coming up with interpretations. Girard, he just wants his social theory, he and Bible acceptance everywhere. But it's a vehicle. So yes, thank you.